All right, welcome back, FHS Biology students. This is our next lecture in the Chemistry of Biology unit that we've been studying. This one focuses on the carbon compounds and the four major macromolecules. So looking at the learning targets here, by the time you're done with this unit, you should be able to identify the chemical elements that bond with carbon to make life's most important molecules. You should also be able to differentiate between a monomer and a polymer. You will be able to identify the four major macromolecules, identify monomers or the single parts of those four major macromolecules, and then identify the functions of the four major macromolecules. Okay, we start out by talking about chemistry because chemistry is talking about carbon because carbon is a very special element in that it bonds very easily with many different elements. And the reason it does that is because it has four valence electrons or four outer shell electrons, and it can form these strong covalent bonds with many other elements, including hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And the way I remember them, if you put a C up here for carbon, this spells out CHNOPS. CHNOPS is the first letter of CHNOPS is the first letter of the element that makes up those elements in many different living things. Now again, carbon atoms bond easily with each other because they have what we call four outer shell electrons. Because of these four outer shell or valence electrons, it can easily form other covalent bonds with itself or with those other different elements of the CHNOPS. Chains of carbon atoms can even close up on themselves to form rings. These carbon atoms can also easily form single, double, or even triple bonds with other carbon atoms. Okay, so the major macromolecules are giant molecules that are made of much smaller molecules. We call the giant ones formed together polymers, and the ones that make them up, the single ones or the smaller ones, are monomers. So you can see right here, all of these different monomers right here, mono meaning single or one, all of these one parts or one pieces are forming together like a puzzle to form one larger chain or a larger molecule that we call the polymer. These macromolecules are formed through polymerization, in which these large compounds right here are formed by joining the smaller ones together. The monomers form the polymers. That's a big idea from this right here. The monomers, which are the smaller pieces, form the polymer, which are all those smaller pieces put together. There are four different macromolecules that are found in living things. So again, one of the learning targets from this lecture right here is, and maybe not even just from the lecture, but from the unit that we'll do after this, is that you will be able to identify those four macromolecules and also the functions of them. We also would like you to be able to identify the smaller parts or the monomers that come together to form these macromolecules. So I'll give you examples in the next couple of slides of how that works. But here's your four major macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Okay, the first major macromolecule is the carbohydrate. Just like it sounds with carb, hydro, and the eights are the oxygen, it's made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. Glucose, or sugars, are a form of a carbohydrate. Now, the functions of these carbohydrates is that they are the main source of energy in living things. When you eat sugars, that sugar is converted to energy that you use. Plants and some animals and other organisms also use carbs for structural processes. The cellulose in plants is used for a structural purpose. Now, these organisms store the extra sugar as complex carbohydrates known as starches. The monomers in starch are the sugar molecules such as glucose. So again, we talk about starting with the smallest part of these carbs. Glucose would be the monomer, the single part. When you combine glucose into a chain, that forms the starch. And the starch would be the polymer, so the larger molecule of it. Single sugar molecules are known as monosaccharides. And if you put a bunch of those monosaccharides together, it forms a polysaccharide. So again, the single sugar molecules is the monosaccharide. A bunch of those single monosaccharides put together form a polysaccharide. Okay, the second of the four major macromolecules are lipids. Lipids are made mostly from carbon and hydrogen atoms and usually cannot be broken down in water. And it's because lipids are fatty substances. So the common categories of these lipids are fats, oils, and waxes. And you know, if you try to put oil in water or a fatty substance like grease in water, it doesn't break down very easily in the water. The functions of the lipids is it can be used to store energy. Lipids are also important parts of the membrane, the cell membrane. And then some lipids form waterproof coverings because of that fatty substance. Okay, third of the major macromolecules are proteins. Proteins are macromolecules that contain nitrogen as well as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The proteins are polymers of the smaller monomers called amino acids. So the smaller part of proteins, what makes them up, are combining amino acids together. The functions of protein is to control the rate of chemical reactions. They regulate cell processes. They form cell structures. They're used to transport substances into or out of cells and also used to fight diseases. And then the last of the major macromolecules is the nucleic acids. Nucleic acids contain hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. So most of those CHNOPS elements that we saw on the first slide. And then nucleic acids are polymers that are made up from the smaller parts called nucleotides. So again, one of the learning targets is to know the smaller parts of these large macromolecules. Nucleotides combine to form a nucleic acid. And then the function is nucleic acids can store and transmit genetic information. So here's an example of a nucleic acid. These are the nucleotides right here. Individual nucleotides can be joined to form the polynucleotide or the nucleic acid. There's two different types of nucleic acid that we'll talk about later on this school year, and that is RNA and DNA. And that is it for this lecture on the four major macromolecules. When I see you in class next, you will do a lab type assignment on identifying the different parts of these nucleic acids and the functions of those.